what those three reports conclude. Now, before I go to the whole subject of genocide, let's just talk about the Jim Crow charge. What I was talking about there was the claim that many Israelis and Israel's supporters, many of Israel's supporters make that we share values. Okay, that in other words, the United States of America and Israel have the same values. And the point I was making is the only values that we share with the Israelis are old values that are thankfully now gone, which dominated mainly in the South after the American Civil War and up to the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And that's when Jim Crow America was alive and well in the South, and even to some extent in the North, to be honest. But anyway, Israel today is basically the equivalent of the Jim Crow South. That's certainly true in the West Bank and in Gaza. We could argue what it looks like inside Green Line Israel, where it's not quite as bad as in those two other places. But anyway, that's the context in which I brought up the Jim Crow analogy. And again, I was talking about apartheid.
Right. I think it's spot on, by the way. We had Chaz Freeman, Aaron Mate and I interviewed Chaz Freeman, and he's compared Israel's ideology to the KKK's ideology. So
It's amazing what's happened to Israel. I find it very hard to believe. I mean, I was someone who, I came of age in the 1950s, and my whole view of Israel was deeply informed by Leon Uris's famous book, Exodus.
Exodus.
I had a very romantic view of Israel, and I thought that the Israelis were clearly the good guys, and that the Palestinians, or the Arabs, as people called them at the time, were the bad guys. And it's amazing the extent to which people like me and many other people I've known have fundamentally changed their view of Israel. And there are a number of factors that explain that. But what Israel has become, and you see this manifested in the war in Gaza, it's just really hard to believe. Uh, but anyway, that's where we are. Let me say a few words about genocide.
Yeah, please.
Uh, I think that if you look at the South African report that was submitted to the ICJ, and I think 84 pages long, thoroughly documented, a really well done report on what the Israelis were doing in Gaza as of late December 2023. You want to remember that they sent their report to the ICJ in late 2023. And then it was in January 2024 that the ICJ, based on that report and all sorts of other pieces of information, the ICJ said there was sufficient evidence to make the case that uh, there was a plausible uh, case to make a plausible case that Israel was committing genocide. And if you look at what Israel has done since January 2024, it has in no way taken its foot off the accelerator. It's continued to pound um, Gaza, and it's not surprising that South Africa has intervened again with the ICJ because they were so disturbed by what's been happening since the ruling. But anyway, I paid careful attention to the report, the South African report. I listened to all the testimony, and I've been studying the issue myself. And I think when you look at what is necessary uh, to prove genocide and you look at what the Israelis are doing, I think it's hard not to conclude they're engaged in genocide. And I think that eventually the ICJ, when they resolve it once and for all, will reach the conclusion that this is genocide.
It's interesting what you said. I've heard a lot of people say this, that, they used to support Israel and now they don't. But how much of what Israel's doing now is a departure from the way they used to be versus how much is it that we just see it on social media? I mean, because Israel was founded, right, through, even Benny Morris admits, he doesn't use the word, but ethnic cleansing or transfer, as he admits, as he calls it. Um, so I guess my question is, how much has Israel changed versus how much we've just seen it for what it is?
I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you in good part, but not completely. There's no question that from the beginning, the Zionists who came to Palestine understood that there was going to have to be massive ethnic cleansing for purposes of creating a Jewish state. There's no way that Zionists coming out of Europe and landing in Palestine, where there is a large population of Palestinians, can create a Jewish state without doing significant ethnic
Right.
cleansing. And of course, they cleansed or transferred. Transfer was the word back then. They transferred about 750,000 Palestinians in 1948, many of whom, by the way, went to Gaza. And
Right.
many of these people fighting today are descendants of those people who were pushed out in 1948. And then the second big cleansing was mainly in the West Bank after the 1967 war. And there's no question that what the Israelis did, especially in 48, was absolutely horrific. And there's also no question that we didn't know much about it in the West. And furthermore, the Israelis were able to purvey this story that the Arab armies, which went to war against Israel shortly after it declared its independence, this is, I believe, May 14th, 1948. The Israelis declare their independence, and Israel then ends up in a war with a number of Arab armies. And the story that we were told when I was young was that the reason the Palestinians left was not because they were cleansed, but because these Arab armies told them to leave. They were going to come in, they would kill all the Israelis or all the Zionists or all the Jews. And once they were done killing them, throwing them into the sea, the Palestinians could come back to their house or to their houses.
Right.
This story is completely false. There's no evidence to support it. The Israelis cleansed Gaza. And what's happened is we have figured all of this out with the passage of time. Just very quickly, if I can tell you sort of what I think is the series of events that changed not only my thinking, but all sorts of people's thinking
Yeah.
about Israel and undermined this Exodus story that was so firmly entrenched in people's minds a long time ago. The first big event is the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Uh, that was heavily covered in the media. And here you see the importance of the media. This gets back to the very important point you were making, especially about social media today. But the media began to cover things in a big way in 1982 in ways that it didn't in 1948, and we saw what was happening. And it was a terrible picture. And of course, the massacres in Sabra and Shatila did enormous damage to Israel's reputation. Then in the late 1980s, the new historians came along. You mentioned Benny Morris's name, but Ilan Pappé was another prominent figure. Avi Schleim was another prominent figure. And there were a number of other people as well. And they got access to the Israeli archives and they told the story about what really happened in 1948. They told you how Israel was created. And they not only told you what happened in 1948, they took you back to the early 20th century and told you how people like Ben Gurion thought about what was necessary to create a Jewish state in a sea of Arabs. And what's very important to understand here is that once you heard the explanation that people like Morris and people like Schleim and Pape were providing, you understood that it made perfect sense, right?
Right.
You understood that the Israelis or the Zionists had to do terrible things to create a Jewish state. It was just unavoidable. So, from a logical point of view and from an empirical point of view, or from the historical record, you began to see what was really going on in terms of how Israel was created. Now, third thing you want to keep in mind is you had the first Intifada in 1987. This is the first big public uprising. Again, this is when you have a lot of news coverage. And then in the 90s, the situation began to move back in the other direction because of the Oslo peace process. But that all failed. And then you had the second intifada. And after the second intifada and more historical work being done on Israel, especially by Arab and Palestinian scholars, this is another very important part of the change that took place since I was a young man, if not young boy. In those days, it was basically white people who, Europeans and Americans who created the discourse about Israel. And most of those people were super friendly to Israel. They were pro Israel. That world has gone away. You now have lots of people like Rashid Halidi, right,
Yeah.
who can tell a very different story. And I want to be very clear here. It's not just Rashid Halidi, it's also the fact that you have lots of Israelis, lots of American Jews, lots of American non Jews who are telling the same story that Rashid Halidi is telling.
Yeah.
Right? There are different twists on all these stories that these people tell, but the same basic story is being told. And now, today, we have alternative media. And you and I talking here is a perfect example of this. You couldn't do this in 1982. You couldn't even do it in 2000 at the time of Camp David, right? When Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat were at Camp David in late 2000 trying to negotiate a settlement. You had no alternative media. You had to depend on the New York Times and CBS and NBC. And of course, what you got was very slanted. You didn't get a critical eye looking at what was going on. Now you have, people like people like Aaron, people like Max Blumenthal, just all sorts of people, Chaz Freeman, uh, me, Steve Walton, so forth, and so on. We're all out there, opining on these events, and the discourse has just changed drastically, and it's very hard for Israel's defenders uh, to uh, deceive us, and we're making it very hard for them to deceive, Middle America or Middle Germany or Middle France, right? So uh, the whole discourse has just changed in fundamental ways, and it is not advantageous to Israel.
Right. Although what's frustrating is that we've seen public opinion shift, but public policy has not caught up with it.
No
Or
question.
right.
No. I mean, the lobby, the lobby operates at two levels. When Steve and I wrote our book, this is one of the first things that we figured out. The lobby is deeply interested in controlling the discourse as much as it can, because controlling the discourse is related to public opinion, what the people in the body politic think. And that's where they've lost out in recent years. That's what we were just talking about. But they care more about the elite level.
Right.
And there they continue to be wildly successful. It's really quite remarkable. And we'll see this on display on June 24th when Benjamin Netanyahu comes to talk to Congress. I think the only interesting question is how many standing ovations will he get? And what you see is that the lobby continues to maintain tremendous influence on the legislative branch and on the executive branch, and that hasn't changed. And the interesting question moving forward, as I'm sure you recognize, is whether or not all of this change down below will have an impact up on top.
Right. And here's the book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, which Professor Mearsheimer co-wrote with Stephen Walt. What has changed since you wrote that book, besides the public opinion? I mean, is it much easier for people to criticize Israel than it was then?
Yes, and I think you can now first of all talk about the lobby itself in ways you couldn't back then. You can talk about the U.S.-Israeli relationship in ways you couldn't back then. And you can talk about whether or not the lobby is doing good things for Israel and for the United States, or not in ways that you couldn't back then. So I think that Steve and I did have a lot of influence on the discourse, and a good number of people in the lobby have told me that over the years. But their view is that we may have had influence on the discourse, but we're not having any influence on policy. And as I said a few minutes ago, that's true. But I think the two things that have changed that really matter the most for the lobby and are not good for the lobby is that, first of all, it has to work harder than ever to defend Israel. Uh, and it's really working overtime these days. And that means it's out in the open. And lobbies don't want to operate out in the open. You want to operate in very subtle and sophisticated ways. Uh, Whether you're the National Rifle Association, the Cuba lobby, the China lobby back in the day, or the Israel lobby, but they are out in the open. Everybody can see evidence of the lobby at work. And this is not good at all. The second thing is they're not able to operate in a subtle way anymore. They're basically now engaged in what I call smash mouth politics. And if you're a lobby, I don't care whether you're the NRA again or the Cuba lobby or the Israel lobby, smash mouth politics is not the way you want to go because you're going to end up alienating lots of people. So what you have, you know, the bottom line here is that what you have is you have a lobby that is much more exposed today than it was in 2006 when Steve and I wrote the article, in 2007 when we wrote the book. Much more exposed and is engaged in smash mouth politics in ways it certainly was not back then. So this is a real problem for the lobby. And then you can marry that to our earlier discussion of the changes that are taking place down below um, in the population, certainly among younger people, including many American Jews.
Right.
Right? As you know, I like to make this point that it is a fundamental mistake to make the argument that all Jews are in the lobby or all Jews support Israel. Nothing could be further from the truth, as was evidenced by the fact that in almost all of those college and university protests in recent months, large numbers of Jews were involved and were arrested.
Right. And is Biden's decision to not curtail Israel, is it rational or is it ideological? In other words, he always talks about what a Zionist he is. But could he have said to Israel, "You're not going to do this," without losing the election? Okay, thank you so much. Have a great night.
You too. Goodbye,
Bye.
Katie.
Bye. What a wonderful interview. Wow, he was so generous. We got so much time with him. I'm very, very happy. And want to thank everyone for tuning in. We have two quick updates we wanted to share. One is that friend of show, she's actually